being vulnerable and assuming the other person is understanding gets you a lot further than the default approach.
Trying to stay vulnerable, even though that's really hard. But like we talked about, it actually makes you invincible in some ways because you're laying it all out there and you're exposing yourself and you're being vulnerable.
I don't like this, or I would like this. Those come across, it seems subtle difference, but if I tell you that you're doing something wrong, that's attack. That's that reverse defensiveness, like you said. But if I say, I don't like this, there's nothing to argue there. Well, one that I got is just, I guess I've become a little bit more of, is this worth it? Like thinking ahead a little bit more, right? In terms of, is it worth this approach that I'm going to take, right? Because sometimes taking the wrong approach, it feels good in the moment when you're upset and you want to say something. And we don't even say, bad things, but just the way that a thing is approached. Because for one thing I'm like, all right, well, do I really want to talk about that next week about at the end segment? Do I really want to and so many times I've made that mistake, but I find myself doing it less because I think a little bit more ahead and say, is that really, is it worth it? Is this going to be worth what's going to happen next after this? And so, so I think that's helpful. And then that just helps me. I've learned to just think about, okay, before I say something, let me think about what will happen. And let me think about how I can rephrase it and come at this from assuming the other person is understanding and that I just need to communicate what is going on, or what I would like to see, or what is troubling me, as opposed to, it's really easy to, by default, come in an accusatory way, saying, why did you do this? Or you're doing this and this is upsetting me, or this, like, as opposed to saying, oh, this happened and here's how I feel about this, right? Like the more vulnerable, like we talked about, I think being vulnerable and assuming the other person is understanding gets you a lot further than the default approach. But it takes a minute to realize that, all right, I got to stop and think before I say something, and think about, how can I say this in a much more empathetic way, and how can I even just change my mind? Because a lot of times I do think we at least I can see myself, even though I'm bulldog mindset, the anti-victim mindset, but we all can be susceptible to victim mindset thinking, and something happens to us and we go down that rabbit hole. And a lot of times I think approaching the topic, a lot of times the default is from the victim standpoint, right? Which usually looks like some kind of accusation, because you're like, oh, how did they do this to me? Or I can't believe that this, right? And that's not it's usually what's happening in a good relationship with the person that you love is a misunderstanding.
Right.
It's usually not intentional. It might be, you could say that maybe it's neglect in the sense of not thinking about something, or not putting enough care into something. But even that is still a misunderstanding, because we all have a lot of things going on. Like we all have different perspectives. And so I think that's helped me to just think a little bit ahead and say, all right, well, how will this end? What's going to happen? Is this worth this? What is a better way?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, like you said, vulnerability is a huge thing, because accusatory statements is essentially defensiveness.
Yeah.
Like, it is. You're like accusing somebody, like you're being defensive of how it's their fault, rather than saying, hey, I'm hurt right now. I feel this because this thing happened. Instead of, like, if you're accusatory, you're like, you did this to me. Like, that's not going to get you the response that you want. I mean, it shouldn't get you an aggressive response, but you're essentially shaming somebody for your feelings, and maybe it was their part in it somehow, but it's still almost like attacking, like you defending your hurt to someone else. Like it's defensive in the other way, right? Like
exactly.
You're defending your hurt so much that you're attacking somebody with your defense. It's like if you had a shield, you're just ramming them with the shield. Like, yeah, it's a shield. It's not a arrow.
Right.
But you can still mess somebody up with a shield.
Yeah, Captain America, bam.
The better way, exactly, is, coming from that vulnerable place. And like you said, having grace with your partner because like you said, majority of the time, it's not going to be intentional at all. So, trying to stay vulnerable, even though that's really hard. But like we talked about, it actually makes you invincible in some ways because you're laying it all out there and you're exposing yourself and you're being vulnerable is definitely the better way to be, which that's also, kind of like getting rid of the defensiveness. That's also hard to do, to be vulnerable when you're used to keeping your guard up and protecting yourself, which those normally go hand in hand. Because if you're defensive, you're defending, that part inside of you that you want to keep safe, and being vulnerable is exposing that. So yeah, it's hard to break out of those patterns, but when you do, it is valuable and it will make your relationships better.
Yeah.
Because of that.
And and I've talked about it before, but it's so much better. And I've learned to say, I don't like this, or I would like this. Those come across, it seems subtle, the difference, but if I tell you that you're doing something wrong, right? That's attack. That's that reverse defensiveness, like you said. But if I say, I don't like this, there's nothing to argue there, right? You don't have to. You can't defend yourself against. I don't like this. No, you're not evoking defense in the other person.
It's a statement
because it's true that you don't like it. Like there's no, someone can try and argue that you should like it, but you don't. It's like, But when you say you shouldn't have done this, now there's a defense that can be made. Well, that's
an expectation.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Which is a whole nother part. And I was going to say, even saying you shouldn't have done this is an expectation, or whatever the first thing you said was. Those are expectations versus I don't like this.
Right.
I like this.
Yeah.
And that's also not controlling because you're not saying you need to do this or don't ever do this. You're just saying what you like and what you don't like.